etc. So to some extent, you may be disappointed with how I'm going to answer this, just as a warning, but part of it has to do with the fact that anyone can be Antifa. You form a group. There is no central command. There is no leader. There is no playbook. Anyone can form an anti-fascist group. There is a network called the Torch Network that some groups coordinate with. Equivalent formations exist in Britain, like the Anti-Fascist Network and so forth. But it's a politics that has specific traditions and specific perspectives around not turning to the state, not turning to the police, not having a pan-socialist outlook, working to deny a platform to the far right. But beyond that, it's come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. It's a matter of self-identification. People can be part of an Antifa group and part of just about any other kind of left formation. So in that way, it does have porous boundaries, intentionally so. And so in a certain sense, it's more of a tendency or a politics or an activity. And sometimes anti-fascist groups will form black blocs, sometimes they will not. So for example, in the 80s and 90s, in the British anti-fascism, usually the anti-fascists would dress in what they referred to as casuals. So that way, as one anti-fascist from Leeds described it, the police wouldn't know if they were fascists, anti-fascists, or hooligans when things got dicey. And there was a story I read when some British anti-fascists came to Germany for like a regional get-together, met the German anti-fascists, and when they had a joint march and all the German autonomen dressed in black bloc with helmets, the British felt very uncomfortable and wanted to march separately in their kind of like football gear. So, there's different perspectives about it. The guy I spoke to said that, if you're all uniformly dressed in black, he argued, it's easy to tell who's who in a larger demonstration. So, interestingly, in Britain over the last 10 years, there's been more of a continental Antifa-Eurification of the British anti-fascist movement, where there's more of a use of black bloc. But even so, the members of the London anti-fascists I spoke to said, for some large demonstrations, black blocs make sense. For some smaller group actions, they don't dress that way because you can be spotted out more easily. So there's a range of perspectives. But in that sense, it isn't as clear of an entity as I think that you may think that it is.
And between the U.S.
and differences between the U.S. and Europe. Well, I mean, to some extent, anti-fascism anywhere reflects what the left looks like there. So that's one thing. But I think also, Europe has more of a continuous continuity of these kinds of politics. It seems in the U.S. there's some degree of kind of reinventing the wheel every 10 or 15 years with this, at least since the 80s. Also the role of football in the European sense of football, playing soccer here, right? Playing a bigger role. But even so, I've spoken to some members of supporters clubs of American soccer teams who are bringing in the anti-fascist angle in that too. So that's changing as well. So there's a few thoughts.
Well, the reason I ask is because the intelligence agencies, some of them are starting to talk about characterizing Antifa as terrorists.
Okay.
So if they're going to do that, are they going to have certain criteria they're going to use to assess and base it, comparing people who are protesters, people who are engaging in civil disobedience?
Okay.
But they said that also about Black Lives Matter.
Right. So the question is about the idea of Antifa being terrorists. And the point was brought up that's also been an allegation brought with Black Lives Matter and just about any significant left tendency.
And Occupy.
And the
environmentalists.
We could go around and
animal rights.
Right, yeah. So part of the issue obviously is that that's sort of what states do.
Exactly.
But it's especially strange considering this is sort of an activity. So it's like, the picket line is a terrorist group. It's like, I don't know what that would look like. But to get back to the point, though, I think, though, it is a consideration, but should be viewed as a tendency that states do to repress social movements and resistance. And I think even people who disagree with anti-fascist methods should stand against this and realize this is an attack upon all of us. And so in the interest of time, I just want to get a sense of how long we want to go, how many more we should take. 2 more? Okay, all right. How did anti-fascism in the East Bloc differ from the West? Very good question. So, the anti-fascism of the 70s and 80s in Europe largely grew out of on the one hand, kind of a neo-Nazi skinhead movement, on the other hand, reemergence of different far-right parties and groupings. And some countries had more state repression of those developments, others had less. In the Eastern Bloc, that kind of simmered for a long time, and at many times fused with a kind of nationalist right-wing resentment against the Soviet bloc governments, and so it really kind of, in a very visible way, broke out with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet era. Then you have just horrific waves of right-wing xenophobic fascist violence. But there are a few academic articles written about the formation of Antifa groups in East Germany before the fall of the Berlin Wall, where there was this growing neo-Nazi movement, but ironically the East German government could not admit it because they had already sort of declared victory over fascism with the fall of the Nazi regime, and admitting that there was a neo-Nazi threat would basically be admitting that they had to some extent failed in their mission, so they ignored it. But this sort of mostly punk, West German-inspired Antifa movement countered it in the streets and was brutally repressed by the state when it did that. But really the issue grows more when the Berlin Wall falls, when the Eastern Bloc falls, and then there's been really intense struggles. And really, in European anti-fascism, the most intense struggles over the past couple of decades have been in the East. I have a section in the book about Greece, but I only briefly touch upon Russia and Ukraine and Poland, in part because I just didn't have as many good contacts and there's less written in English about it. But over the last decade, about a dozen Russian anti-fascists have been murdered. It's a very intense struggle that dates to the fallout of this era, when there's this sort of nationalist religious fusion with certain right-wing politics against the Soviet legacy. So, yeah, ugly stuff. One more?
What's to be done when fascism starts taking over formal institutions as opposed to just, people out there screaming in the streets, such as with ICE being, actual terrorist organization? How does Antifa situate itself within that context?
Sure. So the question for those who couldn't hear is what's to be done when the enemy is not small groups out in the streets, but this kind of politics is evident in institutions. For example, with ICE, when you have deportations of people and state violence more generally, I suppose, is sort of where we're going with the conversation. And right, so there's sort of different kinds of fascisms or enemies, right? There's what do you do if there's a small group or a medium group that's trying to ascend? What do you do if there's a respectable party in parliament? What do you do when there are these state forces, and what do you do when there are these structural challenges? And it seems to me that there is no one-size-fits-all for all of that, right? You can't have the same kind of strategies and tactics against some neo-Nazi boneheads as you would to try and stop ICE, right? That is self-evident. But I think where we can see certain kinds of overlaps is the question of how we can organize popular direct action politics. And so in that sense, we can think about some of the ways that we learn to confront the far right on the street could be used to block deportations, could be used to empower people who are sitting in offices to demand whatever kinds of demand is being demanded. So my sort of modest thought in response to that is thinking about direct action politics as it relates to popular struggles and as a sort of tactical cross-pollination on different kinds of issues. But ultimately, to get back to the earlier conversation, it is also a question of how do we build a new society, how do we dismantle state oppression, how do we dismantle borders, and that, of course, is such a bigger question that requires organizing on all fronts, popular struggle, and can't simply be reduced to sort of the militant anti-fascist groups that are targeting one very specific part of the larger conversation. So it's, once again, sort of a non-answer, but all to say that in a certain